Anxiety has been kicking my ass lately, and I want to fight back. And the best way to fight back is with knowledge. Well, why are we talking about neuroscience? If you don't know what causes your anxiety, you're at a disadvantage when it comes to trying to change it. Inversely, if you do know what causes your anxiety, you're at an advantage when it comes to trying to change it. And that's what the point of this video is, to help you to stop being at a disadvantage and to be at an advantage. So that's what we're going to do. The purpose of this video is to help share some knowledge that can help people figure out how to better overcome and relieve themselves of anxiety. So the big questions answered to this video, well, why are we talking about neuroscience in the first place? Anxiety is generated in the brain. So by studying the science that focuses on the brain, we're going to have our best chance of figuring out a way to relieve and confront our anxiety. How is anxiety different from fear? This question is designed to help define what anxiety is. Most people describe what anxiety is, they'll end up describing fearfulness, which isn't necessarily the same thing. What are the main causes of anxiety in the brain? The background on this question, it was just so interesting to me. It helps put everything into perspective, and it really did change how I perceive the world and people as a whole. Why do we overthink? Why are emotions like anxiety so hard to control? This question is so interesting to me because finding out the answer, it changes how you perceive people. It does. When you understand how emotions work, why anxiety and other emotions are so powerful, and why they end up overpowering people's lives, and how you can lose yourself to a moment, that was so helpful to me to learn. And how can we use this knowledge to help relieve anxiety? Fear versus anxiety. Fear and anxiety are often used interchangeably, but they are different emotions. Fear is what you feel when there is a present or imminent threat, or at least a perceived imminent threat. So let's say that there is a man, it's almost Halloween. Let's say you're wearing a Michael Myers mask and there's a dude with a knife, and that dude's coming at you. The feeling that you fear in that moment, that's fear. That's fear. You're fearful of the person trying to attack you. Anxiety, however, is when you're feeling those same emotions, but there's no imminent threat around. And that's how you can see how anxiety is kind of irrational. There is a purpose to anxiety, but it does get problematic very quickly, and more people they're feeling as if those problems are becoming more problematic. What are the two main sources of anxiety in the brain? There are two neural pathways in the brain that generate anxiety. There is the amygdala pathway, which is also known as the fear center of the brain, and the cortical pathway. The cortex refers to like the part of the brain that most people see when they see brains. It's the wrinkly part of the brain, the gray part, has all those folds. What those folds do, they're designed to help maximize the surface area of the brain without taking up more space than necessary. And an example of how important these folds and wrinkles are, if we didn't have them and we had a smooth brain, animals that have smooth brains are notably very unintelligent. An example would be a koala. Koalas have very smooth brains. Koalas are so dumb that if you were to they only eat one thing. They eat eucalyptus leaves. Koalas eat only eucalyptus. And so their only food source comes from a tree, comes from leaves. If you were to take those leaves off of the tree and put it on a plate and hand that plate to a koala, the koala would not be able to perceive what you're giving to it. It would think that it's a rock or something like that, and it would ignore it. And that just goes to show like how these folds work and how important like the thinking part of the brain really is. The amygdala pathway, the reason why it's called the fear center of the brain is because it's the location of the fight or flight response. Some people refer to it as the fight or flight or fear response, fight or flight or freeze response. Some even go as far to call it the fight or flight or freeze or fawn response, but I'm just gonna call it the fight or flight response for brevity's sake. So the amygdala, there's two amygdala, but there are two amygdala, one on either side of the brain, in the center, attached to the brainstem. This almond-shaped nubbin here is the amygdala, and there's one on each side, and it's attached to the brainstem here. And the amygdala is also known as like the lizard brain. It's a very primitive part of the brain, and it functions on an unconscious standpoint, whereas the cortex is very functional. It's very conscious. So why do we overthink? cortical anxiety in one word can be summed up as overthinking. Thinking is good. Thinking is the reason why we've gotten so far as a society. But doing anything in excess is a problem. And the more you do it in excess, the more that problem exacerbates. And that's what cortical anxiety does. So cortical anxiety, in many words, it refers to your excessively worrying, thinking about what can go wrong, or rumination, which is when rumination is when you have a thought and you process it, right? Well, then if you have like cortical anxiety, you're going to keep processing and 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 processing, and you see how that's getting annoying, right? It's not very functional. It holds you back because it gets you stuck in a loop. This type of thinking is what's called maladaptive thinking, which means that your thinking can't really change. It gets stuck. That's why many people get stuck in a rut. Perfectionism, which is what I struggle with. Fear of failure, fear of success. Thinking like, oh, you want to get every single piece of information laid out before doing something. That's what cortical anxiety is like, and that's how you can see how problematic it is. And it negatively impacts your ability to handle fear by going too far with your negative thinking, and that's how it can hurt you. And this question here is very interesting. Why do we struggle to control emotions? The reason is due to how the amygdala is designed. So the amygdala is also referred to as the locus of the fight or flight response. But it's also highly important when it comes to processing emotions. So the fight or flight response, when you're in fight or flight, this is what your brain looks like, okay? Your thinking part of the brain, the cortex, that goes offline. The amygdala is designed to override your thinking part of the brain in order to act as quickly as possible. It's located lower on the brainstem. It's located physically lower on the brainstem, closer to the rest of your nerves in your body, in order to help your body act as fast as possible. It's referred to as the lizard brain because it's a very primitive part of the brain that many creatures have it, even a koala would have it. And it's your body's primary defense mechanism. From when you're out in nature, for example, and there's a lion that can come jump out and attack you, you have to be on point. You have to be able to react fast because those split seconds are enough for you to be lion food or surviving and being able to procreate and create progeny in the future. And so that's what the amygdala does. It literally turns off the thinking part of your brain while it's activated, and now you can kind of see why when you're emotional, you may end up saying things that you don't actually mean. You'll just say stuff that ends up hurting the person, but isn't actually productive to resolving the actual issues. It's because when you're in fight or flight mode, you're just focused on either hurting them enough where they're not going to be able to hurt you back. You're going to be focused on trying to avoid them entirely, or you're going to freeze and just try to hope that they don't see it and they don't bother you. And that's kind of how the amygdala impacts the brain. And when it comes to amygdala-based anxiety, it's when your amygdala, your fight or flight response, is kind of you're stuck in fight or flight mode, or your fight or flight response is triggering in situations where it really doesn't have to be. And the interesting about this is that it's purely unconscious, right? As we mentioned before. And so oftentimes amygdala-based anxiety is overlooked by therapists, because most time people go to therapy, talk therapy in particular. Historically, therapy only focuses on the cortex and ends up overlooking the amygdala-based anxiety because the amygdala is unconscious, and you typically only perceive the anxiety as the effects that present itself to you. And these effects are when your heart starts to beat faster, when your eyes widen. This is when you get blushed, when you get flushed, when you're feeling anxious. When your cortisol levels spike, when your adrenaline starts to spike, the amygdala is what's responsible for these things. And when you have an overactive amygdala, that can cause a wide variety of problems. And I know somebody who has very sensitive amygdala based anxiety, and I can see how much it really impacts them. And look up to a point where like they don't even know that they're feeling anxious because the amygdala isn't even um, it's not conscious. And this is why it's important to talk about the two differences between the two. Historically, as the amygdala has been overlooked, this treatment has been overlooked as well, and that's the problem. But now we know that there is a way to like. This explains why you may be feeling like sweaty or anxious for like no reason. So how can we use this knowledge to help relieve anxiety? Well, hopefully we now know how to differentiate and identify the two different types of anxiety. And that means that we're better able to look for tools to help alleviate those types of anxiety. Is treating cortical anxiety is different from treating amygdala-based anxiety. The core of treating cortical anxiety is based around modifying your cognitions, which cognitions are your thought processes. And there's a variety of ways to do that, and most therapies focus on relieving and helping you modify your cognitions. And there's CBT, which is a very common cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a very common tactic for treating and modifying cognitions. Cognitive restructuring, thought stopping. Thought stopping is when you realize that you're thinking something in a certain way, and then an example of thought stopping would be the rubber band on your wrist, right? It's to like hit the brake button and try to like stop certain thoughts from like popping up, or checking yourself, identifying when you're thinking certain things. The secret to relieving amygdala-based anxiety is focused on altering your fear response. And one of the most famous ways to do this is through exposure therapy, which is when you expose yourself to the thing that causes your anxiety in the first place. And then the idea of it is to keep exposing yourself to those things, and in order to and with the goal of trying to lessen the response each time. So it's like, let's say you're afraid of snakes, and then you see a snake. For exposure therapy, it'd be like you see a snake, you let yourself feel anxious, you let it happen. But then the next time you do it, your goal is to have a slightly less exaggerated response to that fear, to that snake. And I feel like I hope that this video has helped put things into perspective, explain some concepts. I hope it was fun because I do think these ideas are interesting. And if you appreciate the video, please leave a like and comment down below. Subscribe. If you really want to support, follow my Patreon. And thanks so much for watching. Hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.